Amber Miller was only 10 years old, but the weight of the world already rested heavily on her small shoulders. She lived with her mother, Catherine, in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. The walls were thin, and the persistent hum of the city always echoed through their home, but they had learned to live with the noise. Life was tough, but for Amber, this was the only life she knew. Her mother, Catherine, worked as a nurse at the local hospital, pulling long, grueling shifts. The demands of her job were relentless, leaving her exhausted most days, yet she always found time for Amber. Catherine was a single mother, fiercely independent, and determined to provide the best life she could for her daughter. But it was never easy. The bills piled up faster than she could pay them, and sometimes their dinners were nothing more than a simple bowl of soup. Amber understood the struggle. She saw it in the dark circles under her mother's eyes, in the way her hands trembled from exhaustion at the end of a long day. But Catherine never complained. Instead, she smiled through the pain, reassuring Amber that everything would be okay, even when Amber could hear her crying softly behind the closed door of her bedroom late at night. For Amber, school was a brief escape, but even there, the weight of their situation lingered. She didn't have the latest shoes or a brand new backpack like the other kids. Sometimes, she caught the whispers and the sideways glances from her classmates, but Amber wasn't one to let that get to her. She was resilient, just like her mother. Besides, Amber knew her mother was doing everything she could, and that was enough for her. When Amber wasn't at school, she was at home, trying to help her mother in any way she could. She would clean the small apartment, make her own snacks, and sometimes even attempt to prepare dinner before Catherine returned, although it was usually something simple like peanut butter sandwiches. Amber understood, even at her young age, that her mother was fighting a battle she could barely keep up with, but that didn't stop Catherine from trying. Their bond was unbreakable, forged in the fires of hardship. Amber admired her mother more than anyone else in the world. She was strong, even when life knocked her down repeatedly. Yet, as much as they had each other, there was a quiet emptiness that lingered in their lives, a void that both of them felt but rarely spoke about. Amber had never known her father. He had disappeared from their lives before she was old enough to remember him. Catherine never talked about him, and Amber had learned not to ask. The absence was a silent companion in their home, a shadow that followed them, though neither mother nor daughter acknowledged it. But in the moments when Catherine's exhaustion overwhelmed her, and Amber was left alone to think, she would wonder what her father was like. Was he kind? Did he love her before he left? These questions floated in her mind like clouds, but Amber always pushed them away. She had her mother, and that was enough. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Despite the challenges they faced, Amber remained hopeful. She believed things could get better. Her optimism was a quiet strength, something she had inherited from her mother. Catherine often told her, "As long as we have each other, we'll be okay." And Amber clung to those words, holding on to the belief that one day, their struggles would ease and they could finally breathe. However, deep down, Amber knew her mother was holding something back, something more than just the stress of work and bills. There was a secret that weighed on Catherine, something from her past that Amber couldn't quite figure out. But, as young as she was, Amber had learned that some questions were better left unasked. Life went on, day by day, a slow rhythm of routine and hardship. Amber attended school, did her homework, and tried to be as helpful as she could. Catherine continued her long shifts at the hospital, coming home more tired with each passing week. The city outside their apartment buzzed with life, but inside, it was just the two of them, surviving. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was theirs. And though the days were hard, Amber had no doubt in her heart that her mother's love made every sacrifice worth it. Yet, despite her strength, Amber couldn't help but feel that something was about to change. She didn't know how or why, but deep within her, there was a growing sense that their lives were on the verge of something new, something unexpected. And she was right. Amber walked down the cracked sidewalk, her old sneakers scuffing against the uneven pavement as she wandered through the familiar streets of her neighborhood. It was a chilly afternoon, and the autumn wind tugged at her worn jacket, but she didn't mind. These small walks gave her a brief escape from the cramped apartment and the weight of her mother's struggles. She wasn't heading anywhere in particular, just circling the few blocks that made up her world. The same rows of brick buildings, the corner store with its flickering neon sign, and the playground where she used to play, now mostly empty as the colder days set in. Amber often found herself thinking during these walks about her mom, their lives, and that gnawing feeling that there was more to the world than this tiny slice of Chicago. Today felt no different at first. Her mind drifted as she walked, hands shoved into her pockets, until something unusual caught her eye. Lying in the middle of the sidewalk, just a few feet ahead of her, was a wallet. It was thick, almost bursting at the seams, as if whoever owned it carried their entire life inside. Amber froze for a second, her eyes darting around. The street was empty, not a soul in sight. The wallet seemed so out of place, just lying there, waiting for someone to notice. Slowly, she approached it, her heart beginning to race. What if this belonged to someone important? What if it was a sign? Kneeling down, Amber picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned it over in her hands. It felt heavy, much heavier than any wallet she had ever seen before. She hesitated, her heart pounding, and then, almost instinctively, she peeked inside. Her breath caught in her throat. Cash. More cash than she had ever seen in her life. Bills, thick and crisp, stacked together in neat bundles. Amber's eyes widened, her mind racing. With this money, she could help her mom. They could pay off bills, buy groceries, maybe even fix the broken heater in their apartment that never seemed to work right. For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming. Amber could feel it in her chest, a warm, seductive feeling, whispering that this could solve everything. Just take the money. No one would know. Whoever dropped it was rich enough not to miss it. But then, as quickly as the thought had come, Amber shook it away. She knew better. Her mother had raised her to be honest, no matter how difficult life got. Catherine always said, doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's what separates us from the rest. Amber could almost hear her mother's voice in her head, that steady, calming tone that always guided her in moments like this. Swallowing hard, Amber took a deep breath and pulled the rest of the contents from the wallet. There was a thick stack of cards, credit cards, IDs, business cards, all with the same name, Richard Foster. The name felt familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. She stared at the ID, studying the face of a man she had never seen before. He looked older, stern, the kind of man who had probably never worried about a day of bills in his life. His address was listed on the ID, too, an expensive-sounding street downtown. Amber's mind raced. She could just drop it at the police station. That would be the simplest way out, right? But something tugged at her. It wasn't just about returning the wallet. It was about making sure the right person got it back. And deep down, Amber knew that if she handed it over to the authorities, it might disappear into a bureaucratic mess. No, she was going to return it herself. It was the right thing to do, and it was the only way she'd feel at peace. Besides, maybe, just maybe, this Richard Foster would be grateful enough to give her a small reward. Amber knew it wasn't the reason she was doing this, but a part of her couldn't help but hope. Without another thought, she shoved the wallet into her backpack and began walking faster, her destination now clear. It would be a long trip to the address on the ID, almost all the way across town. She would need to take the bus, and that would eat into what little money she had saved. But Amber didn't care. She had made up her mind. As she boarded the bus, the reality of what she was doing began to settle in. The downtown area was like another world to her, far from the gritty streets she was used to. She'd only been there a few times, and every time it felt like she didn't belong. The buildings were taller, shinier, and the people walked around like they were in a hurry, always dressed in expensive clothes, never stopping to notice someone like her. But today, she was heading straight into that world, with nothing but a wallet and a sense of duty guiding her. The bus ride felt endless, but finally, after what seemed like hours, Amber stepped off at her stop. She looked up at the towering buildings around her, the cold wind whipping through the streets, and for a moment, she hesitated. What if this was a mistake? What if the man in the ID wasn't kind or grateful? What if he thought she was just some kid from a poor neighborhood trying to pull a scam? But Amber shook the doubts from her mind. She wasn't doing this for recognition or reward. She was doing this because it was the right thing to do. With that thought in her heart, she gripped her backpack a little tighter and set off towards the address listed on the ID. Each step felt heavier than the last, but there was no turning back now. And as she rounded the corner, her breath caught in her throat once again. Before her stood a mansion, its gates tall and imposing. The kind of place she had only ever seen in movies. This was Richard Foster's home. Amber's hand trembled as she reached for the doorbell. She didn't know it yet, but ringing that bell would change everything. For her and her mother. Amber's heart pounded in her chest as she stood in front of the enormous mansion, its towering gates casting long shadows across the immaculate driveway. She had never seen anything like it before, grand, almost intimidating in its perfection. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, with pristine white walls and large windows that reflected the late afternoon sunlight. It felt like a world so far removed from her own. Yet here she was, standing at its doorstep, clutching a wallet that could easily solve all the problems she and her mother faced. Her hand hovered near the doorbell, but doubt started to creep in. She wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't her world. What if no one believed her story? What if they accused her of stealing the wallet? Amber bit her lip, shaking off the nervous thoughts that swirled in her mind. She had come too far to turn back now. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button. A distant chime echoed through the house, and Amber waited, her pulse quickening with each second. The mansion was so quiet, so still, that for a moment she wondered if anyone even lived there. But just as she was about to ring the bell again, the front door creaked open. A man stood there, older, wearing a crisp black suit. His eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned her from head to toe. He didn't say anything at first, and Amber suddenly felt very small under his scrutinizing gaze. "Can I help you?" he finally asked, his tone formal, almost distant. Amber swallowed hard. I found this," she stammered, pulling the wallet from her backpack and holding it out in front of her like a peace offering. "It belongs to Richard Foster. I wanted to return it." The man's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he didn't take the wallet. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. "Wait here," he said before disappearing down one of the long hallways. Amber's feet felt glued to the marble floor of the entryway. The inside of the mansion was even more breathtaking than the outside. The ceilings were high, adorned with chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. Every inch of the space seemed meticulously designed, from the intricate rugs to the artwork hanging on the walls. It was overwhelming. She felt out of place, standing there in her scuffed sneakers and worn jacket, surrounded by so much luxury. But before she could dwell on her discomfort, she heard footsteps approaching. A tall man, dressed in a tailored suit, emerged from the hallway. His graying hair was slicked back, and his face was stern, just like the ID in the wallet. He was Richard Foster. Amber's heart raced. She gripped the wallet tightly, suddenly unsure of what to say. But Foster's eyes landed on the wallet in her hands, and a flicker of recognition crossed his features. "That's mine," he said, his voice deep but steady. Amber nodded and stepped forward, extending the wallet toward him. "I found it in the street, near where I live," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "I wanted to make sure it got back to you." For a moment, Foster simply stared at her, as if trying to figure her out. Then, without a word, he took the wallet from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest second. He opened it, quickly checking the contents, and Amber watched as his face softened, just slightly. He seemed relieved. "You brought this all the way here?" he asked, looking down at her with an expression that was no longer as intimidating as before. Amber nodded again, feeling a bit more at ease. "Yes, sir. I thought it was important to get it back to you." There was a pause, a long moment of silence where Richard Foster just stared at her, as if trying to piece together why a girl like her, someone who looked so out of place in his grand home, would go through all the trouble to return a wallet she could have easily kept. "Why?" he asked, his voice soft but curious. "Why didn't you just keep it?" Amber blinked, surprised by the question. "Because it wasn't mine," she said simply. "And my mom always says it's important to do the right thing." Foster's expression shifted slightly, his stern demeanor cracking just enough for Amber to see something else behind his eyes. Something thoughtful, almost impressed. He stood there for a moment, considering her words, then looked past her toward the butler who had opened the door earlier. "Prepare some tea for our guest," Foster said, before turning back to Amber. "And please sit." Amber felt a wave of surprise. She hadn't expected to be invited in, let alone offered tea. But she obeyed, hesitantly sitting down on the edge of a plush armchair in the living room. She felt out of place again, her hands nervously resting on her lap as she watched Foster move across the room. He seemed to be deep in thought, almost as if her presence had stirred something in him. "You said your mother taught you to do the right thing," he said after a moment, standing by the large window overlooking the vast gardens outside. "That's a rare quality these days." Amber shrugged. "It's just how we are." Foster turned to face her again, his eyes studying her more closely now. "And where is your mother? She must be proud to have a daughter like you." The mention of her mother made Amber's chest tighten. "She's at work. She's a nurse. Works long hours at the hospital." A silence settled between them. Foster's gaze softened for a moment, a distant look in his eyes, but then he quickly composed himself. The butler returned with the tea, setting it down on the table in front of Amber, but she barely noticed. "I'd like to meet your mother," Foster said suddenly, breaking the silence. "To thank her. Perhaps you and she could join me here for dinner one evening." Amber blinked, unsure of how to respond. Dinner? Here? She couldn't even imagine her mother sitting at one of the long, elegant tables in this mansion, let alone dining with someone like Richard Foster. But the offer was genuine, and there was something in the way he spoke that made Amber feel like this was more than just about gratitude. He was intrigued, curious about her and her mother. I can ask her," Amber finally replied, feeling her voice waver slightly. Foster nodded, as if satisfied with that answer. "Good," he said. "I'd like that." Amber stood, suddenly feeling the urge to leave. The weight of the situation was starting to settle on her, and she needed time to process everything that had just happened. She thanked Foster again and made her way toward the door, her heart still pounding with a mixture of nerves and disbelief. As she stepped back outside, the sun had already begun to set, casting a golden hue over the mansion's sprawling lawns. Amber couldn't shake the feeling that something big had just shifted in her life. This wasn't just about returning a wallet. This was the beginning of something she couldn't quite understand yet. And as she walked away from the mansion, she knew her mother needed to know everything. But deep down, Amber couldn't help but wonder, why had Foster invited them to dinner? And what would this mean for her and her mother's future? Amber could hardly contain her excitement as she walked home that evening. The encounter with Richard Foster had left her with a strange, uneasy feeling, but she was also curious about why a man like him would want to meet her mother. What did he see in them? What could a wealthy, powerful businessman like Richard possibly have to say to them beyond a simple thank you? By the time Amber reached their apartment, the sky had already darkened, and the city lights flickered to life, casting an orange glow over the streets. She rushed up the stairs to their door, eager to tell her mother everything. As she pushed open the creaky door, she found Catherine sitting at the kitchen table, still in her nurse's uniform, her face worn from another long day of work. "Mom," Amber called out, her voice filled with excitement. Catherine looked up, her tired eyes softening at the sight of her daughter's energy. "You won't believe what happened today." Catherine smiled faintly, setting down the cup of tea she had been sipping. "Tell me, sweetheart, what's got you so excited?" Amber launched into the story, explaining how she had found the wallet, how she had made the decision to return it, and her meeting with Richard Foster. She told her mother about the mansion, the grandness of it all, and finally, Richard's invitation to dinner. Catherine's face froze at the mention of Richard Foster. The name, though common, seemed to strike something deep within her, something buried under years of silence. Her smile faded, and her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles turning white. "Richard Foster?" Catherine's voice was quiet, almost trembling. "Are you sure that was his name?" Amber frowned, noticing the sudden change in her mother's demeanor. "Yeah. Why? Do you know him?" Catherine didn't answer right away. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and crossed the small kitchen to the window, staring out at the street below. Her mind raced, memories she had long since locked away flooding back all at once. She hadn't heard that name in years, not since Amber was born. But now, it was all coming back, and she couldn't stop the flood. "Mom." Amber's voice was small now, concern creeping in. "What's going on?" Catherine turned around, her face pale, and sat back down, as if the weight of the years had suddenly crashed down upon her. "Amber, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Amber's heart raced, her chest tightening with anticipation. "What is it, Mom?" Catherine hesitated, the words catching in her throat. How could she explain everything? How could she reveal the painful truth she had kept hidden for so long? She took a deep breath and finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Richard Foster is your father." The room seemed to grow still, the silence pressing in on them. Amber stared at her mother, the words echoing in her mind, but they didn't make sense. Her father? Richard Foster? The man who had disappeared from their lives before she could even remember him? "But you said he left us," Amber managed to say, her voice shaking. "You said he didn't want anything to do with us." Catherine closed her eyes, the guilt and regret weighing heavy on her heart. "That's what I believed, Amber. I thought he had abandoned us. I thought he didn't care. But there's more to the story than I ever told you." Amber's mind raced, trying to process this new revelation. All her life, she had believed her father had walked out on them, leaving her mother to raise her alone. She had accepted that he was gone, and for the most part, she had stopped wondering about him. But now, everything was shifting beneath her feet. "What happened?" Amber asked, her voice barely audible, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Catherine sighed, her gaze distant as the memories she had buried so long ago resurfaced. "When I found out I was pregnant with you, Richard and I were still together. We were young, and everything seemed perfect. He was ambitious, always working, always thinking about the future. But then, something changed." Amber listened closely, hanging on to every word as her mother continued. "Richard had a business partner back then, someone I thought was a friend. His name was Mark. He and Richard were building something big together, something that would set us up for life. But one day, Mark told Richard something that changed everything. He told Richard that I had plans to leave the country with you, that I was planning to disappear and take you away." Amber's brow furrowed. "But that's not true." Catherine nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Of course it wasn't. But Richard believed him. He was consumed with his work, with his business, and he didn't confront me. Instead, he vanished from our lives, thinking I had already left. By the time I found out what had happened, he was gone. I tried to reach him, but it was like he had disappeared into thin air." Amber's stomach churned as the pieces began to fall into place. Richard hadn't abandoned them out of coldness or indifference. He had been manipulated, deceived. And all these years, Amber had grown up without a father, believing he didn't want her, when in reality, it had all been a terrible misunderstanding. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Amber whispered, feeling the tears prick at her eyes. Catherine wiped at her own tears, her hands trembling. "Because I didn't want you to grow up feeling angry or abandoned. I wanted you to have a normal childhood, without the weight of that hanging over you. But maybe I should have told you. Maybe I should have let you decide how to feel." Amber sat in silence, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. She felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, confusion, sadness, and even a flicker of hope. Her father hadn't left because he didn't care. He had been lied to, just like them. But why now? Why had their paths crossed again after all these years? Then Amber remembered the invitation. Dinner. Richard had invited them to his home for dinner. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know the truth. "Mom," Amber said softly, "we have to go to that dinner. He doesn't know who we are. He doesn't know I'm his daughter." Catherine looked at her daughter, her heart aching. She knew Amber was right, but the thought of facing Richard again after all these years terrified her. What would he say? What would he feel when he learned the truth? But there was no turning back now. The past was about to catch up with them, and they couldn't run from it any longer. Catherine nodded slowly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Okay, Amber. We'll go." The day of the dinner arrived much sooner than Amber or Catherine expected. Time seemed to slip away in the days leading up to it, as if both mother and daughter were moving through a fog of uncertainty and fear. Amber had spent the past few days in a haze, her mind swirling with the revelation that Richard Foster, the man she had met by chance, was actually her father. The thought of seeing him again, this time, knowing the truth, filled her with a nervous energy she couldn't shake. Catherine, on the other hand, was deeply conflicted. She hadn't seen Richard in over a decade, and the last time they had been in the same room, he had believed she was about to run away with their unborn child. The weight of that misunderstanding had followed her through every year, every sleepless night. How would he react when he saw her again? Would there be anger, regret, or worse, indifference? The two of them dressed carefully that evening, neither speaking much as they prepared for the dinner. Catherine wore a simple black dress, her hands trembling as she smoothed it out in front of the mirror. Amber, sensing her mother's anxiety, remained quiet, her mind racing with questions. Would Richard recognize Catherine? Would he understand the truth? They arrived at the mansion just after sunset, the house looming above them like a shadow. Amber felt the familiar surge of nervousness as they approached the front door. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just about returning a wallet. This was about confronting the truth that had been hidden for years. The butler opened the door before they could knock, his face neutral but polite as he stepped aside to let them in. The house looked as grand as it had before, with its gleaming floors and towering ceilings. But tonight, it felt even larger, more imposing. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. "Mr. Foster is expecting you," the butler said, gesturing for them to follow. Catherine's hand tightened around Amber's as they walked through the long hallway, her steps hesitant. The closer they got to the dining room, the more Catherine's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't seen Richard in so long, and the years had done little to dull the pain of their parting. She had imagined this moment so many times. What she would say, how she would explain everything. But now, standing on the edge of that reality, she felt unprepared. They entered the dining room, and there he was. Richard Foster stood at the far end of the long table, his back to them as he adjusted something on the sideboard. When he turned around, the room seemed to freeze for a moment. His eyes fell first on Amber, a small smile forming on his lips. But then he saw Catherine, and the smile vanished. His face went pale, the glass in his hand slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. "Catherine?" he breathed, as if saying her name brought back years of memories he had long buried. Catherine stood frozen, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if time itself had stopped. The silence was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard's voice cracked when he spoke again. "What? How?" Amber watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like an outsider in her own life, witnessing something too big to fully understand. Her mother's past was unraveling before her, piece by piece, and there was no way to stop it. Catherine took a shaky breath and stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Richard, it's been a long time." Richard blinked, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality in front of him. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her, and certainly not like this. "Why are you here?" His voice was tight, laced with confusion and disbelief. Catherine's hands trembled at her sides, but she straightened her back, forcing herself to face him. "I didn't know Amber was bringing your wallet back to you," she began, her voice unsteady. "But when she told me your name, I realized it was you. We need to talk, Richard, about what happened, about everything." Richard's eyes flicked to Amber, then back to Catherine, the shock still evident on his face. "Amber?" he repeated, his gaze narrowing in confusion as he looked at the young girl standing nervously at the side. "Who?" Catherine inhaled deeply, her throat tight, and her next words came out like a confession she had waited years to give. "Amber is your daughter, Richard." The room fell into a silence so thick it was suffocating. Richard stared at her, his eyes wide, his breath shallow, as if the ground had just crumbled beneath him. His gaze shifted back to Amber, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "My daughter," he whispered, the words barely audible, as if saying them out loud might make them real. Amber felt her knees weaken beneath her, but she stood firm, holding Richard's gaze with a mixture of fear and hope. She had imagined meeting her father in so many different ways, but not like this, not in a moment of shock and pain. "Yes," Catherine said softly, stepping closer, her voice steady but filled with years of regret. "She's yours. I tried to tell you, but you were gone. I thought you left us, Richard. I thought." Richard's voice broke, his emotions finally spilling over. "I didn't leave," he shouted, the sudden outburst startling both Amber and Catherine. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the length of the dining room, his mind racing. "You left. I was told you were gone, that you had run off with our child." Catherine shook her head fiercely, her own voice rising in response. "No, I never left, Richard. I never had any intention of leaving you. I was right here, waiting, but you were gone. I tried to find you. I tried to reach you." Amber stood frozen between them, her eyes darting from her mother to Richard, the weight of their words crashing over her like waves. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had imagined a reunion full of joy, of relief. But this was anger, confusion, years of hurt being laid bare. Richard stopped pacing, his eyes filled with disbelief and pain as he looked at Catherine. "I was lied to, wasn't I?" His voice was softer now, almost broken. "Mark, he told me you were leaving, that you had taken Amber and run away." Catherine's face crumpled with the weight of the truth, her hands shaking. "Yes, Richard. Mark lied. He set us both up." Richard's breath hitched, and he stared at the floor for a long moment, his thoughts unraveling in front of him. His business partner, his trusted friend, had been the one to destroy his family. And all these years, he had lived with the belief that Catherine had abandoned him, that his child was gone. Amber's voice finally broke through the silence, small but steady. "I grew up thinking you didn't want us," she said, her eyes locked on Richard's. "Mom never told me the whole story. I thought you left." Richard's chest tightened, a deep well of regret rising within him. He looked at Amber, really looked at her for the first time, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had missed everything. Her childhood, her first steps, her first words, everything. He had missed his daughter's life, all because of a lie. "I didn't know," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know." The room was heavy with the weight of the years lost, the words unsaid, the pain they had all carried for so long. But now, it was all laid bare, the truth finally out in the open. For the first time, Richard looked at Amber not as a stranger, but as his daughter. And in that moment, something shifted between them. A flicker of recognition, of understanding. But the path ahead was still uncertain, and the years of hurt couldn't be erased in a single night. Amber, Catherine, and Richard stood at the edge of something new, but fragile, unsure if they could ever fully mend what had been broken. Amber sat at the long dining table, her hands resting on her lap, fingers trembling slightly as she replayed the evening's events in her mind. The truth was out. Richard Foster, the man who had stood before her in disbelief just minutes ago, was her father. The air between them hung heavy, charged with emotions too complex to name. She glanced at her mother, Catherine, who had fallen into an uneasy silence after the heated confrontation with Richard. It was like the room was holding its breath, waiting for someone to break the stillness. Richard stood at the far end of the room, his back turned to them, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if to steady himself. He hadn't moved since Catherine's revelation. The truth had hit him like a storm, relentless, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. Amber could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was struggling to process the years of lies, the missed moments, the family he didn't know he had. She tried to make sense of it all, how her life had changed in an instant. Just a few days ago, she had been living her normal life with her mother, believing her father had walked away from them before she was even born. Now, that entire narrative had been shattered, replaced with a tangled web of betrayal and lost time. Amber had so many questions, but they all felt tangled in her throat, heavy with the weight of emotions she didn't know how to express. She looked at Richard again, wondering what he was thinking. He hadn't said much since Catherine told him the truth. Could he really accept her as his daughter after all these years? Would he even want to? Before Amber could form the words to speak, Richard turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. There was something different in his expression now, a mixture of sorrow and recognition. He looked at her not just as a stranger or the girl who had returned his wallet, but as someone he should have known, someone he had missed without even realizing it. "Amber!" His voice was low, thick with emotion, as if he were testing the sound of her name on his lips for the first time. Amber's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to respond, to say something that could make this moment easier, but nothing came. She wasn't sure what to feel. Anger? Sadness? Relief? It was all too much. She had imagined meeting her father so many times over the years, but not like this. Not with years of misunderstanding and heartbreak hanging over them like a cloud. Richard slowly crossed the room, each step deliberate, as if he were afraid to break the fragile thread connecting them. When he finally stood in front of her, he hesitated, his hands shaking slightly as he knelt down to be at her eye level. The distance between them felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice breaking with regret. "I swear, Amber, I didn't know." Amber blinked, her vision blurring with tears she didn't realize had gathered. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to accept that he hadn't left her on purpose, that he hadn't chosen to be absent from her life. But the hurt was still there, lingering beneath the surface. A decade of feeling unwanted couldn't just disappear in an instant. "You didn't know," she echoed, her voice small, "but you still left." Richard flinched as if her words had struck him physically. I thought your mother had taken you," he stammered, his voice raw. "I was told that you were gone, that you didn't want me in your life." Amber's chest tightened. "I never even knew you," she whispered. "I grew up thinking you didn't want me, that you left us." The pain in Richard's eyes deepened, and Amber could see the weight of his regrets settling in. He had missed everything. Her first steps, her first words, every birthday, every milestone. The enormity of it all seemed to crash down on him at once. "I would have never left if I had known," Richard said, his voice cracking. "I lost so much time with you. I didn't know, Amber. I swear I didn't know." Amber's hands clenched in her lap, her heart torn between believing him and holding on to the hurt that had defined her childhood. It was so easy to stay angry, to let the resentment keep her safe from the disappointment of what could have been. But seeing the tears in her father's eyes, the sincerity in his voice, Amber felt something shift inside her. The room was so quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock in the background. Catherine remained at the edge of the room, watching silently, her own heart breaking as she saw the pain in both Richard and Amber. She had never imagined this moment would be so complicated, so filled with raw emotion. She wanted to protect Amber, to shield her from the heartbreak of it all, but she knew this was a journey her daughter had to walk on her own. After what felt like an eternity, Amber finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Why didn't you try to find us? After all these years, why didn't you look for us?" Richard's eyes closed for a brief moment, as if he were bracing himself for the pain of his own answer. "I did," he whispered. "At first, I did. But when I couldn't find any trace of you, when Mark told me you had left the country, I gave up. I thought you didn't want me. I thought I had lost you forever." Amber swallowed hard, her emotions swirling inside her like a storm. She wanted to hold onto her anger, to make him feel the hurt she had carried for so long. But she also saw the man before her, a father, her father, who had been manipulated, who had believed a lie and suffered for it. And in that moment, Amber understood something important. They had all been victims of the same lie. Richard's voice broke through her thoughts, barely a whisper. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Amber. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I want you to know, I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped wondering where you were, what kind of person you had become. And now that you're here, I don't want to lose you again." Amber's throat tightened with emotion. She looked at Richard, really looked at him, and saw the pain, the regret, the years of lost time etched into his face. For the first time, she saw the man her mother had once loved, the father she had never known. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Amber said softly, her voice trembling, "but I don't want to hate you either." It wasn't the reconciliation Richard had hoped for, but it was enough. It was a start. Catherine finally stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "None of this was your fault, Amber," she said, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "And it wasn't your father's fault either. We were all caught in a lie that wasn't of our making." Amber nodded, though her heart still ached. The truth had been revealed, but the pain of the past couldn't be erased so easily. It would take time. Time to heal, time to rebuild trust, time to figure out what their new reality would look like. Richard stood slowly, his movements tentative, as if unsure of how to proceed. "I want to make this right," he said, his voice steady now. "I don't know how, but I'll do whatever it takes." Amber glanced at her mother, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. "I don't know what happens next," Amber said quietly, looking back at Richard, "but I guess we'll figure it out." For the first time since the evening began, Richard smiled, a small, hopeful smile that spoke of second chances. "We will," he said softly. "We'll figure it out together." The days that followed the revelation were a blur for Amber. It felt like her entire world had shifted, but at the same time, nothing seemed to change. The weight of the truth lingered between her and her mother, between her and Richard, creating an invisible wall that was impossible to ignore. She tried to go about her normal routine, school, chores, helping her mother where she could, but the truth gnawed at her constantly. Richard had given her his phone number before they left the mansion that night. He hadn't pressed her for anything, hadn't made any demands. Instead, he simply asked her to reach out whenever she felt ready. He had said goodbye with a promise to make things right, but Amber had no idea what that even meant or how to move forward. How could they make up for lost time when it felt like a canyon had formed between them? Catherine, too, was quieter than usual. Her mother had always been strong, resilient, but Amber could see the cracks now, how fragile she was beneath the surface. It was clear that seeing Richard again had stirred up emotions Catherine had long buried. At night, Amber sometimes heard her mother crying softly behind the closed door of her bedroom, the weight of their past resurfacing with full force. One evening, a few days after the confrontation at the mansion, Amber sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her untouched homework. The numbers and equations on the page blurred together as her mind drifted back to Richard. Should she call him? Should she try to see him again? Every part of her wanted to know more, but she was scared. What if it didn't work out? What if he wasn't the father she needed him to be? Catherine entered the room quietly, setting down her bag after another long shift at the hospital. She glanced at Amber, her tired eyes filled with concern. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice gentle. Amber shrugged, still staring at her homework. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything's different now." Catherine sat down across from her, her hands folded on the table. "I know this is hard, Amber. I wish I could take that weight off your shoulders." "I don't know what to do, Mom," Amber said, her voice small. "I don't know how to feel about him. He's my dad, but he's still a stranger." Catherine reached across the table, taking Amber's hand in hers. "It's okay to feel that way. You don't have to figure everything out right now. It's a lot to process." Amber nodded, but the confusion still sat heavy in her chest. She looked up at her mother, hesitating before speaking again. "Do you think I should see him again?" Catherine's eyes softened with understanding. "That's up to you, sweetheart. But whatever you decide, just know that you don't have to do this alone. I'll be here with you every step of the way." Amber felt a lump rise in her throat, the emotions bubbling just beneath the surface. She hadn't realized how much she needed her mother's reassurance until that moment. "I don't want to hurt you," she whispered. "I know this must be hard for you too." Catherine smiled faintly, though there was sadness in her eyes. "It is hard," she admitted, "but this isn't just about me. It's about you and your relationship with your father. I won't stand in the way of that." Amber let out a shaky breath, her mind swirling with conflicting feelings. She knew her mother was right. This wasn't something that could be solved overnight. It would take time, and maybe it would never be perfect. But deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore the chance to at least try. The next morning, Amber sat on her bed with the phone in her hands, staring at Richard's number saved in her contacts. Her thumb hovered over the screen, hesitating. She had no idea what she would say, no idea how he would respond. But she couldn't avoid this forever. Taking a deep breath, she pressed call. The phone rang only twice before Richard's voice came through, sounding both surprised and hopeful. "Amber?" "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know if you'd be free today, but maybe we could meet?" There was a brief pause on the other end, and for a second, Amber worried she had made a mistake. But then Richard spoke again, his voice filled with quiet relief. "Of course. I'm free whenever you are. Just tell me where, and I'll be there." They agreed to meet at a small cafe near the edge of the city, a neutral place where neither of them would feel out of place. Amber felt a knot of anxiety settle in her stomach as she arrived, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of Richard. When she saw him, standing awkwardly near the entrance, looking almost as unsure as she felt, she realized something. He wasn't just the powerful man she had met at the mansion. He was nervous too, unsure of how to handle this fragile reunion. As they sat down across from each other, Amber felt the silence between them grow heavy again. But this time, there was something different about it. It wasn't filled with anger or hurt. It was filled with uncertainty, the kind that comes when two people are trying to find their way back to each other. "I'm really glad you called," Richard said softly, breaking the silence. "I didn't want to push you, but I've been thinking about you a lot." Amber nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking too," she admitted. I don't really know where to start." Richard gave her a small, tentative smile. "We don't have to figure everything out today. Let's just start small." They spent the next hour talking, slowly and awkwardly at first. But as time passed, the conversation began to flow more naturally. Richard asked her about school, about her hobbies, about the things she liked. It was strange, in a way, like getting to know someone who was supposed to be familiar but was still a mystery. Amber found herself relaxing little by little, letting her guard down just enough to let him in. And Richard, for his part, seemed genuinely interested in everything she had to say. He didn't press her about the past or try to force a connection. Instead, he listened, really listened, as if trying to absorb every detail of the daughter he never knew. Amber saw the regret in his eyes every time she mentioned something he had missed, a birthday, a school event, the little moments of her life he hadn't been there for. But he didn't dwell on it, and neither did she. They both seemed to understand that looking back wouldn't help. They had to move forward. When they finally said goodbye, Richard stood awkwardly, as if unsure of how to end the meeting. Amber gave him a small, uncertain smile, the same knot of emotions twisting in her chest. "I'll call you again," she promised, her voice soft. Richard's eyes brightened with hope, his smile widening. "I'd like that." As Amber walked home, her thoughts were still a mess, but for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of something else, something lighter, like maybe things could get better. It wasn't going to be easy, and she knew there would be more difficult conversations ahead. But at least now, there was a chance for something new. That night, as Amber lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she thought about everything that had happened. Her father wasn't perfect. Her mother wasn't either. And she certainly wasn't. But maybe that was okay. Maybe they didn't need to be perfect to find a way forward together. Amber's days slowly began to take on a new rhythm, one that included Richard in small, careful doses. The initial awkwardness between them had started to soften, replaced by tentative curiosity. They met a few more times over the following weeks, short meetings at the cafe, walks in the park. Each time, the conversation came a little easier, the connection between them growing bit by bit. Amber was still unsure of her feelings toward him, but she no longer felt the overwhelming tension she had before. There was something about the way Richard was trying, the way he seemed so genuinely invested in getting to know her, that made it hard for her to stay closed off. Catherine, on the other hand, remained distant from the situation. She never discouraged Amber from seeing Richard, but she kept a quiet distance, almost as if she were waiting for the other shoe to drop. She had always been strong for Amber, but Amber could sense the internal struggle her mother was facing. Catherine wasn't ready to confront Richard herself. Not yet. It was a chilly Saturday afternoon when Richard finally decided to take a bold step. Amber had agreed to meet him at a small cafe downtown, and the atmosphere inside was cozy, the warm scent of coffee filling the air. They sat in a corner booth, talking quietly about Amber's schoolwork, when Richard suddenly paused mid-conversation. His face grew more serious, and Amber noticed the shift immediately. "Amber," he began slowly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "There's something I've been thinking about. It's something important." Amber's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing. She set her cup of tea down, suddenly feeling the weight of whatever was about to come next. "What is it?" she asked cautiously. Richard took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. "I know I can never make up for the time we've lost," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But I don't want to lose any more time with you. And with your mother." Amber's brow furrowed, unsure where this was going. "What do you mean?" Richard leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I want us to try to be a family again." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and filled with possibility. Amber blinked, her mind struggling to keep up with the enormity of what he was saying. A family? After all this time? How could they possibly do that? "I know it sounds like a lot," Richard continued quickly, sensing her hesitation. "But I don't mean we need to rush into anything. He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I want to be a part of your life, Amber. And I want to make things right with your mother, too." Amber's heart pounded in her chest. The idea of Richard and Catherine trying to reconnect, of the three of them attempting to form something resembling a family, felt overwhelming. She had only just started to figure out her relationship with him, and now he wanted to bring her mother into it as well? Her first instinct was to pull back, to reject the idea. It was too much, too soon. But then she saw the vulnerability in Richard's eyes, the quiet desperation behind his words. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or pretending that everything could be fixed overnight. He was simply asking for a chance to be more than a shadow in her life, more than just a man who had once been her father in name only. "I know it's not going to be easy," Richard continued, his voice faltering slightly. "I know there's a lot of pain between me and your mother, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. For both of you." Amber swallowed hard, her mind racing. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to give him a chance. But she also couldn't ignore the complexity of the situation. Her mother had built a life without him, had raised her without his help. Could Catherine ever really forgive him? Could Amber herself forgive him? "I don't know if Mom will want to do this," Amber said quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "She's been through a lot. She's not ready to talk to you yet." Richard nodded, his expression softening with understanding. "I know," he said. "I don't expect her to be ready right away. But maybe, if she sees that you and I are trying to build something, it might help." Amber chewed on her bottom lip, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Catherine too, about the years of hurt and misunderstanding that had built a wall between them and Richard. But as much as it terrified her, there was a part of Amber that wanted to see what could happen if they tried. She didn't want to spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. "I'll talk to her," Amber finally said, her voice hesitant but steady. "But I can't promise anything." Richard's face softened with relief, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's all I'm asking for," he said gently. "Just a chance." That evening, Amber returned home to the small apartment she shared with her mother. The tension had been weighing on her all day, the conversation with Richard replaying over and over in her mind. She knew she had to talk to Catherine about what Richard had proposed, but the idea of bringing it up filled her with anxiety. Her mother had been through so much, and Amber didn't want to hurt her. Catherine was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping from a mug of tea, when Amber walked in. Her mother's tired eyes lifted to meet hers, and Amber felt her heart tighten. Catherine had always been her rock, her protector. The idea of asking her to open up to Richard again, to relive all that pain, felt like too much. But Amber also knew that she couldn't avoid this. Not if there was a chance to build something better. "Mom," Amber said softly, sitting down across from her. Can we talk for a minute? Catherine set her mug down, her brow furrowing with concern. Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? Amber took a deep breath, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. I talked to Dad today. Catherine's expression didn't change, but Amber could see the flicker of tension in her shoulders. She nodded slowly, waiting for Amber to continue. He wants to try something, Amber said, her voice shaky. He wants us to try being a family again. He said he's willing to do whatever it takes to make things right with you. With me. For a moment, Catherine didn't say anything. The silence between them stretched out, heavy and charged. Amber's stomach twisted in knots, fearing the worst. But when Catherine finally spoke, her voice was calm, though laced with sadness. I don't know if I can ever forgive him, Amber, Catherine said softly. Not for everything that happened. It's not as simple as saying sorry and moving on. I know, Amber said quickly, and he knows that too. But I think he's really trying. He's not asking you to forgive him right away. He just wants a chance. For all of us. Catherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her emotions raw and exposed. It's just hard, she whispered. It took me so long to let go of that hurt, to accept that he was gone. Amber reached across the table, taking her mother's hand. I know, but maybe this is our chance to start over. Catherine looked at her daughter, the pain in her heart battling with the hope in her daughter's eyes. She had spent so many years building a life without Richard, learning to survive on her own. But now, seeing Amber sitting there, filled with both fear and hope, Catherine realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Amber too, about the future they could have. I'll think about it, Catherine said quietly, her voice filled with hesitation. But I can't promise anything. Amber nodded, feeling the weight of her mother's words. It was more than she had expected. That's all I'm asking for. A week passed, and Amber felt the tension growing thicker with each day. Though she had relayed Richard's proposal to Catherine, the air in their small apartment remained heavy with unspoken thoughts. Catherine had grown quieter, lost in her own internal struggle. Amber tried not to push her mother, but the weight of waiting for a decision was suffocating. Each day Amber wondered if this would be the day her mother would finally open up about how she felt, about whether she was ready to take the next step. Amber herself had been cautiously rebuilding her relationship with Richard, meeting him a few more times and allowing herself to let him in, piece by piece. But even with the progress they were making, there was an empty space where Catherine belonged. A space that Amber knew could only be filled if her mother and Richard confronted the past. Then, one night, when Amber least expected it, Catherine finally spoke. It was late, the apartment quiet except for the distant hum of traffic from the streets below. Amber sat curled up on the couch, flipping through a book, when Catherine walked into the living room, her face pale and her eyes weary. She stood there for a moment, watching her daughter, before sitting down beside her. Amber, Catherine said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been thinking about what you told me, about your father. Amber lowered her book, her heart skipping a beat. Yeah? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though she could feel the anticipation building inside her. Catherine sighed deeply, rubbing her hands together nervously. This isn't easy for me, she began, her eyes fixed on the floor. I've spent so many years trying to move on, trying to forget the pain. And now, it's all coming back, whether I want it to or not. Amber nodded, unsure of what to say. She could feel the weight of her mother's emotions, the struggle between wanting to protect herself and wanting to move forward. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive him, Catherine continued, her voice cracking slightly, but I also know that holding on to this anger isn't helping either of us. And if you want to have a relationship with him, I won't stand in the way. Amber's chest tightened with emotion, her throat constricting as she heard the words she had been waiting for. Mom, I don't want to hurt you, she whispered. I just want us to try. I want us to be okay. Catherine finally looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. You deserve to know your father, Amber. And if that means I have to face him again, then I'm willing to try. Amber's heart soared with a mix of relief and trepidation. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, But it was a step towards something she had longed for, even when she hadn't known it. The next day, Amber called Richard and told him the news. Catherine was willing to meet with him. The conversation had been brief, but Amber could hear the hope in his voice. He suggested they meet at a quiet restaurant, somewhere neutral, where they could talk without the weight of his mansion looming over them. Catherine agreed, though Amber could sense the nervous energy radiating from her mother as the day of the meeting approached. When the evening finally arrived, Amber and Catherine entered the small restaurant together, the soft glow of candlelight casting warm shadows across the room. The atmosphere was intimate but not overwhelming, and Amber could see Richard already seated at a corner table, his expression a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Catherine hesitated for a moment at the entrance, her hand resting lightly on Amber's arm. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered, her voice wavering. Amber nodded, squeezing her mother's hand gently. "We don't have to decide everything tonight. Just talk." Catherine took a deep breath, nodding slightly before they walked toward the table. Richard stood as they approached, his eyes flickering between Catherine and Amber. There was a tension in his posture, an uncertainty that Amber hadn't seen before. It was clear that he, too, was navigating a sea of emotions. "Thank you for coming," Richard said softly, his voice thick with emotion as he pulled out a chair for Catherine. Catherine sat down slowly, her movements careful, as if she were bracing herself for the weight of the conversation ahead. Amber took her seat next to her mother, watching as the two people she cared about most faced each other for the first time in years. For a few moments, no one spoke. The silence felt heavy, but not unbearable, more like the quiet before something important was said. Finally, Richard broke the stillness, his voice quiet but steady. "I know I've said this before," he began, his eyes fixed on Catherine, "but I need to say it again. I'm sorry. For everything. For not being there. For not trying harder to find you and Amber. I thought I was doing what was best, but I was wrong." Catherine's gaze remained steady, though her expression was unreadable. "You believed what Mark told you," she said softly, "that I had taken Amber and left." Richard nodded, shame flickering in his eyes. "I believed him because I was too caught up in my work. I wasn't paying attention to what was really happening, and by the time I realized the truth, it felt too late." Catherine let out a long breath, her hands resting on the table, as if grounding herself for what came next. "It wasn't just about you leaving, Richard. It was about the years that followed. I had to raise Amber on my own, without any help, without knowing where you were or why you hadn't come back. I built a life without you, and I don't know if I can just let all of that go." Richard's face fell slightly, but he nodded in understanding. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, Catherine. I know it's going to take time, if it ever happens, but I want to try. I want to make things right, not just with Amber, but with you too." Catherine's eyes softened, though there was still a guardedness in her expression. "I'm not sure what right looks like anymore," she admitted. "But for Amber's sake, I'm willing to try." Amber's heart swelled with emotion as she watched the exchange. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. It was raw, fragile, and full of uncertainty, but it was real. And for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward together. Richard looked at Amber then, his eyes filled with both gratitude and regret. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you," he said quietly. "I missed so much of your life, and I can't change that. But I want to be there now, for whatever comes next." Amber's throat tightened, tears welling in her eyes. She had spent so long wondering about her father, imagining what he was like, building up walls around her heart to protect herself from the idea that he didn't care. But now, sitting here with him, she realized that maybe it was okay to let those walls down. Just a little. "I want that too," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. The rest of the evening passed in slow, careful conversation. There were no grand declarations, no promises of an easy future. But there was a mutual understanding that they were all trying, that they were all willing to take the first steps towards something new. As they left the restaurant, Amber walked between Richard and Catherine, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't perfect, it was messy, complicated, but it was a beginning. The weeks that followed their meeting at the restaurant were filled with cautious steps, tentative conversations, and moments of vulnerability that both Amber and Catherine had never expected to share with Richard. The path to healing was not a straight line. It was messy and filled with awkward silences, unresolved feelings, and moments of doubt. But there was also progress, slow, deliberate, but real. Amber found herself growing more comfortable in her relationship with her father. Though the initial tension lingered, their bond deepened with each passing day. She began to trust him, allowing him into her life in ways that felt both foreign and comforting. They would meet for walks, visit the museum, or simply sit in the park talking about her future, her dreams, and the things she had never shared with anyone before. Richard had missed so many of her milestones, but now he was eager to be there for the ones yet to come. For Amber, the most surprising change was seeing her mother slowly open up to Richard as well. Catherine remained guarded, but over time, Amber noticed the subtle shifts in their interactions, little moments of shared conversation, quiet understanding, and even laughter. It wasn't easy for Catherine to let go of the past, but for Amber's sake, she was willing to try. And in those moments, Amber felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. One afternoon, as the crisp autumn air began to settle over the city, Richard invited them both to his mansion for dinner. The idea of returning to the place where everything had started filled Amber with a mixture of nerves and excitement, but she knew this was an important step for all of them. As they approached the mansion that evening, Amber couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since the first time she stood at those gates. Back then, she had been a girl returning a wallet, unaware of the life-altering discovery that awaited her. Now, she was coming back with her family, imperfect, fragile, but a family nonetheless. Richard greeted them at the door, his smile warm and welcoming. The atmosphere inside the mansion felt different this time, less imposing, more personal. The dining room, once filled with tension, now felt like a space where something new could grow. The table was set with care, and the soft glow of the candles flickered gently, casting a warm light over the room. Catherine seemed more at ease than Amber had expected, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. She exchanged a quiet glance with Richard as they sat down, and Amber noticed the unspoken understanding between them. It wasn't reconciliation, not fully, but it was something. Dinner passed smoothly, filled with light conversation and shared stories. Amber listened as her mother and Richard spoke about the past. Not the painful parts, but the good memories. There was a softness to the way Catherine spoke of their early days together, before everything had gone wrong. And though Amber knew there were still wounds that couldn't be healed with words, she saw the effort they were both making, for her and for themselves. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where the conversation grew more personal. Richard looked at Amber, his expression thoughtful. "There's something I've been thinking about for a while," he said softly, glancing briefly at Catherine before continuing. "I know that I can't undo the years we've lost, but I want to be a part of your life going forward, Amber. For real." Amber's heart raced as she met his gaze, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "You already are," she said quietly, though her voice trembled with the weight of the moment. Richard smiled faintly, but there was still something more he wanted to say. "I mean, I want us to be a real family. I know I can't just walk back into your lives and expect everything to be fixed, but I've been thinking about how we could start fresh." Catherine shifted slightly in her seat, her brow furrowing in concern. "What are you suggesting, Richard?" she asked, her voice cautious. Richard hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I know it's a big step, but I've been considering offering you both the chance to live here with me. I know you have your lives, and I don't want to disrupt that, but I want to be more than just someone you see once in a while. I want to be here, every day, for Amber. For you." Amber's breath caught in her throat. Live with him? The idea felt overwhelming, almost impossible. She glanced at her mother, who was sitting stiffly beside her, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Richard," Catherine began slowly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. That's a lot to ask." Richard nodded, his eyes softening with understanding. "I know, and I don't expect an answer right away, but I want you both to think about it. We could build something new here, something we didn't have the chance to before." The room fell into a heavy silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. For Amber, the idea of living in the mansion felt surreal. She had spent her whole life in a small apartment, watching her mother struggle to make ends meet. And now, the man she had only recently begun to know as her father was offering them a life she had never imagined. But it wasn't just about the mansion. It was about the chance to build something new, to create the family she had always longed for. The past couldn't be erased, but maybe, just maybe, they could forge a future that felt whole. Catherine, too, seemed to be grappling with the weight of Richard's offer. She had fought so hard to raise Amber on her own, to protect her from the pain of a broken family. And now, here was the man who had once disappeared from their lives, offering her a second chance. It wasn't easy to trust, and she wasn't sure if she could fully forgive. But for Amber's sake, for their future, she was willing to consider it. "I don't know what the right answer is," Catherine said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "But I'll think about it." Richard nodded, his expression relieved. "That's all I'm asking for." The weeks that followed were filled with discussions, careful considerations, and moments of doubt. Catherine and Amber didn't make their decision lightly. There were still wounds that needed time to heal, and trust that had to be rebuilt. But slowly, they began to see the possibility of a new life, one where they didn't have to carry the weight of the past alone. And one day, as they sat together in their small apartment, Catherine looked at Amber with a gentle smile. "I think we're ready," she said softly. "If you want this, Amber, we'll do it." Amber's heart swelled with emotion, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She had spent so many years imagining what it would be like to have a family, a real family. And now, it felt like that dream was finally within reach. They moved into the mansion a few weeks later. It wasn't an immediate transformation. There were still moments of hesitation, moments of uncertainty. But with each passing day, they found a new rhythm, a new way of being together. Richard wasn't perfect, and neither were they. But they were trying, and that was enough. Amber watched as her mother and Richard began to rebuild their relationship, slowly but surely. There were still difficult conversations, painful memories that resurfaced, but there was also laughter, warmth, and moments of connection that felt real and lasting. For the first time in a long time, Amber felt like she belonged. As winter settled over the city, Amber stood by the large window in the mansion, looking out at the snow-covered garden. Her breath fogged the glass as she smiled to herself, thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. The family she had once dreamed of was finally taking shape, not in the way she had imagined, but in a way that felt real and true. Behind her, Richard and Catherine were in the living room, talking quietly, their voices filled with a quiet ease that had taken so long to achieve. Amber turned to join them, her heart full. They were a family, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.